We began our exploration of Rambam's sprawling introduction to Mishnah several months ago. This is going to be the 6th installment. For those of y'all keeping track at home, we are learning all about the Mishnah, which is the foundational work of Oral Torah. And we're going through the 6 sections known as the 6 orders, the Shisha Sidarim, the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, the 6 orders of the Mishnah. And we're up to the 3rd order, which is Nashim, which translates as women. These are all the books of Mishnah, the books of Oral Torah that deal with men and women, marriage, divorce, and so on. This order is the shortest order, has the fewest amount of books. It has only 7 books, but each one of them is a whopper. Each one of them is a intense and a powerful and wonderful book. So let's learn a little bit about these books of Mishnah in the 3rd order, the order of women, the order of Nashim, women. It starts off, quite interestingly, with the book of Yevamos. Now, what is Yevamos? Yevamos means levirate marriages. Now, what is levirate marriages? So this is sourced actually in our Parsha, Parshas Kiseitze, chapter 25 of the book of Devarim. We read how if there are 2 brothers and one of them dies without any children. So we have a sad situation. A person dies, a man dies. He's married. He has no children. So now his wife is free to marry whoever she wants. She is no longer married. She is single. She's a widow. So the Torah tells us in chapter 25, verse 6 of the book of Devarim, the wife, the widow of the dead person, she just shouldn't go marry anyone else, some stranger, some other person from a different family. No. Instead, she should marry her brother-in-law, meaning the brother of the deceased husband, and that's who she should marry. This is the description it's called in English levirate marriage. Now, what does levirate mean? I don't know. I looked up the definition of levirate. It means yibum. It means this sort of marriage. So it's not really, I don't know what the etymology of the word is, but that's the law that the Torah tells us. And then the verse continues, and the verse tells us that when she pleased God will have a child from her new husband, who is the brother of her deceased husband, then the new child will adopt the name and even the legacy of her previous husband so that his name doesn't get eliminated. This is a way that a brother and a widow can create a lasting legacy for the brother who died without children. His bloodline ends, but no, it doesn't, because it gets assimilated, so to speak, into the bloodline of his brother and his widow. And the verse continues, but if the man doesn't want to do it, he doesn't want to marry his sister-in-law, well, then they have to do some sort of divorce-like process where this eligibility for levirate marriage is annulled through a process called chalitza. He has to go to the court, and he has to make a proclamation, an announcement. I don't want to marry her. And then there's a very unusual process by which she removes his shoe and she spits in front of him, not at him, but in front of him. Very interesting, bizarre sounding process. And the relationship between the two is annulled, and she could go marry whoever she wants, and he is now free to do whatever he wants. But the potential, the possibility of them uniting as a couple is now annulled. That's the 6 verses that we have in the Torah about this subject. And you open up the Mishnah, you have 16 chapters of Mishnah on this. And the Talmud, 120 pages of Talmud, may not sound like a lot, but I'm telling you, it's an absolutely fascinating, very difficult, very challenging, but absolutely delightful book. This was actually the first book of Talmud that I merited to actually finish it from beginning to end, and it's just massive with absolute profound depth, and it's known and feared almost as the most difficult, or one of the most difficult and complex and challenging books of Talmud. That's the basic idea. And the concept is that when a man dies without children, and he has a living brother, in that case, there's, so to speak, an obligation for this association between the living brother, the surviving brother, and the surviving spouse, the widow. They have some sort of association they have to resolve one way or another. Either they get married, and that's known as levirate marriage, yibum in Hebrew, or they have to kind of remove that association with a chalitza, sort of divorce of sorts. Well, it's not a divorce because they're not married, but that they have some sort of association that has to be resolved. Now, in the Torah, actually, in the book of Genesis, we read about an event like this, right? We have the story in chapter 38 of Genesis, where Judah has a wife and 3 sons, and then he has a daughter-in-law named Tamar. And the son of Judah, Tamar's husband, dies. So she marries the next brother, which is a version of this. And then he dies too. And Judah does not want to give him to his third son, to Shelah. He says, go home. She's waiting for the postcard to come back. And then she pulls off the greatest heist of all time, where she actually seduces Judah into spending a night with her. And indeed, she becomes pregnant with twins. We know the story, chapter 38 of Genesis. And this is described as almost like a proto-yibum, a proto-levirate marriage, where the relative of the deceased husband marries the widow. It started off as in the brother, but then it became the father. But of course, at Sinai, this concept of a widow without children, without a legacy, marrying the relative, it was limited to only the brother. Now, I want to read you just the very first Mishnah, or at least part of the first Mishnah of this book. And I think this is it's such a wonderful example of how the Oral Torah unpacks every possible dimension of a law and leaves no stone unturned. And this is a little bit complicated, but there's no way to make it less complicated. I'll make it as simple as possible, but there's no way for it to be simple. Suppose you have 2 brothers. Well, that's the case. If there's no 2 brothers, then there's no subject of levirate marriage. So suppose you have 2 brothers, maybe even 3 brothers. So you have a family of 10 brothers, let's say. And one of them, well, is married to a woman. Wonderful. He dies, unfortunately, without any children. Well, that's the subject, the levirate marriage, one way or the other. There's some sort of association. They have to resolve it either with yibum, marriage, chalitza, this divorce of this association. It's not really divorce, but it's a sort of divorce because they have some association due to the death of the brother/husband. But suppose the brother who died had multiple wives, and none of them have any children. So one brother, multiple wives. He dies without children. Neither of them have children. And we probably have to wait a little bit, to make sure that he has no children, because what if one of them is pregnant, right? We don't know. Maybe she conceived the day before he died. He was hit by a train. So we have to wait to make sure that he actually has no possibility of any living descendants. But we know for sure he has no children. 2 wives. Okay, what happens now? That's not a question that we would immediately think about. That's not even the subject of the first Mishnah. The subject of the first Mishnah is when the deceased brother has 2 wives, but one of those wives, for a different reason, is prohibited to marry the second brother. So let's just paint the example. Brother 1 is married to his niece, the daughter of brother 2. That's a legal, maybe it's not advisable, but it's a legal relationship with the Torah. Brother 1 is married to the daughter of brother 2. And he also has a second wife. He has 2 wives, okay, but we don't do that anymore. It used to be permitted from a biblical perspective. It was prohibited by rabbinic edict, but from a biblical perspective, it's permitted. So brother 1 has 2 wives. One of them is the daughter of brother 2. This is just the background of the first Mishnah. brother 1 dies with no children. We know for sure no children. So now, what happens with brother 2? He definitely can't marry his daughter. That's obviously out of the question. That's prohibited. But what about the other wife, the second wife? So the law states that because he cannot marry either one of them, he is barred from both of them. Meaning, he cannot marry his daughter, obviously, but the law states that he cannot actually marry the other. He can't do yibum to the other, can't have levirate marriage with the other co-wife, so to speak, of brother 1. And then this is where the Mishnah continues. Okay, but suppose it's brother 3. And brother 3 marries, does yibum, levirate marriage, to the other wife, the co-wife, not the daughter of brother 2, but the other wife. The random person. And then he dies without children, and he has a second wife. So the relationship between brother 2 and his new sister-in-law that doesn't have a husband, she is his sister-in-law from brother 1, sister-in-law from brother 3, and co-wife with his daughter from brother 1. This is, if it gets complicated, this is how you're thrown into the book. So the Torah states, and the Mishnah states, but it's proof from the Torah, that he cannot actually marry the second wife of brother 3 because she's a co-wife of the second wife of brother 1, who is a co-wife of his daughter, or any one of 15 different relationships. That's like the beginning of the Mishnah. And I always think about this Mishnah as, first of all, it's an example of what the sages did. Like we said, they leave no stone unturned to reveal every dimension, every part of every law. I wonder how many instances in history ever happened that were like this. Probably very few. But in general, what the sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud would do, they would find the most far-fetched situation or circumstance or case that you could possibly even conceive. And we imagine that it may not ever happen. But the sages always wanted to identify the furthest extent of a given law. And therefore, they're teaching us about the mechanics, so to speak, the halachic mechanics of levirate marriage and all the details of it by giving us this very remote case. But I also think that the architects of the Mishnah were not just some of the greatest sages of all time, but they were some of the greatest pedagogues of all time. And this is the whole book is complicated. It's intricate and complex. And if I were writing the book, I would start off with the law, a normal case, an ordinary case. Just 2 brothers. There's just 2 brothers, and just assume there's only one widow, and learn about the law about of levirate marriage. That's not what it does. It finds the most complex case, and then you have to fit in all the details yourself. And this is, I think, a nice idea, separate point, that children don't learn like robots. You don't build it like an engineer would do, like to build up information. You kind of throw them into it, and the human brain is capable of piecing parts together that weren't even explicitly told, making connections on their own, and building out a deeper understanding of the concept. Now, again, we can't go through all 16 chapters. If we wanted to study this book properly, I'm telling you, without exaggeration, to do it properly, if we want to do it together here on the podcast, let's say, it would take a decade. I'm telling you, how long it would take. And if we do, let's say, only 1 hour a day, it might take a lifetime. Just the absolute, we studied it in yeshiva. We did 10, 12 hours a day for a year. And not all of us were that slow and dense, I promise you. Just the vastness and the profundity, it's just absolutely astonishing. Now, we're trying to get a little bit of an overview of the book, so we can't go to that much depth. Just the first Mishnah, but let's also look about some of the other things that come up. A very interesting part of the book is the last 2 chapters. And as is always true throughout Oral Torah and certainly throughout Mishnah, laws don't necessarily, or we have a hard time necessarily identifying why certain laws are placed in certain places. We have a general theme of every book, but then throughout every book, there's going to be other laws that don't seem to be directly related, but maybe are tangentially related to some of the subjects. And then it goes off on a little law tangent and kind of plunks down a certain set of laws, a certain set of Mishnahs in a book that really is talking about something else. So the final two chapters are talking about a very interesting, very problematic, maybe the most difficult subject of Jewish law. And that is the question of a woman whose husband may be dead or may not be dead. We don't know. Now, a woman can be married to only one man, period. If she's married to a man, she cannot marry another man. And there's two ways for her to move on from her husband. Either, God forbid, he dies, or, God forbid, these are both bad situations, there's a divorce. But what if he just goes? He's on vacation. Goes on a ship, and he's supposed to go to a different port, and we don't know what happened. That's a very, very difficult area of law, because if the rabbi says, okay, ma'am, you're allowed to marry whomever you want, and the husband's actually still alive, that could be an absolute catastrophe. Why? Because she's still married to the husband number one, and husband number two is all excited with his new wife. They have a big family. All those kids are illegitimate. They are all mamzers. Why? Because they were born with adultery. And now, again, it's unwitting adultery, but it's adultery nonetheless. So they're not legitimate. They're mamzers. It's a terrible situation. So we have the Mishnah laws, the last two chapters of this book, dealing with all sorts of circumstances of what evidence and what testimony is admissible in order to permit a woman to marry. Your husband's dead. I saw him dead. Really? Do we have one witness, two witnesses? Is there maybe an agenda that the witness has? Because if you really, really want to mess someone over, you have someone that you hate, you want to get revenge at, then what you would do is, the husband's alive, you give fake, fabricated testimony witnesses that he's dead, and then he shows up. Oh, I'm so excited. I brought you some gift from the Far East. What's going on? Who is this man? Oh, who are these kids? Disaster. So there's an interesting Mishnah. I'll read you initially. There's a lot of interesting Mishnahs. I'll read you one. The husband is going deep sea diving, and he falls into the water. He's in the ocean. God forbid if someone drowns in the ocean, it's quite likely that their remains will never be found. So what do? Is she allowed to marry? He fell into the water. You check, you can't find any remains. Obviously, a terrible and tragic circumstance, but is there even the remote chance that maybe he's alive somewhere? Maybe he's floating on some plank of wood? A lake, a pond, an ocean, a sea. What an interesting question. So the law states that in this situation, man overboard, we don't know what happened to him. That's not enough of a grounds to permit his wife to marry another man. And the Mishnah tells a story of a man who fell into a cistern of water. So he's down, he's in the depths, and he's gone underwater. And somehow, 3 days later, he climbs out. And no one knows what happened. How did he survive? But that's further evidence to the fact someone's underwater. We don't know where they are. We can't see them. We don't have a body. We don't have a corpse. We don't have a cadaver. But we don't have grounds to determine that his wife is allowed to remarry. And then it tells a story here, really interesting, that there was a blind person. The blind person had a guide who would help direct him. And they went to a mikvah. They went to a mikvah to go immerse in the mikvah. And the mikvah was like in a cave. And they go into water. And 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour later, they're just not back. And we don't know. We have no evidence. We don't know if they get caught in a rock or something like. We don't know. And there we find the opposite law, where the sages permitted the wives to remarry. So this is interesting. When the Mishnah is giving us a law, then it's bringing us stories that prove one way or the other. And then it brings yet a third incident that happened. There was a man who was going into sea. Maybe he was going to look for buried treasure, but he was going underwater and didn't have like an oxygen tank with him. What they would do is say, okay, we'll pull you out in 3 minutes. Go see what you could find. And they tied a little rope to his foot, to his leg. And a few minutes after his dive, they start pulling him up, and they pull, there's just a leg there. What happened? Was he bitten by a shark? I don't know. All we have is a leg. Is his wife allowed to marry or not? What a fascinating, tragic, interesting, intriguing story. So what's the law? So the sages ruled in that particular case, the sages ruled that depends how much of the leg you have. If the leg was cut below the knee, well then it's a wound that maybe he could survive. His wife may not remarry. If the leg was cut above the knee, then such a wound, the sages determined, is not one that he's likely to survive. Well, it's one that he's definitely not going to survive from, and therefore his wife may remarry. That's just an interesting part of this big book that primarily deals with laws of levirate marriage. You have at the end these 2 chapters talking about the case of, or the many different cases of how to determine or what to do when a man is suspected to be dead, but we don't know for sure. We don't have conclusive evidence. We don't have a body. We don't have sufficient testimony and witnesses. What's the law? What are the laws? What are some of the different situations and circumstances in that sad and tragic eventuality? Well, that's the first book. And then you move on to the book of Ksubos. Ksubos, that means marital contracts. It's like a prenup. There is a prenup. This is a book that's 2,000 years old, the Mishnah, the Jewish prenup. This is a book that describes all the marital obligations that a man undertakes upon himself when he gets married. What he has to provide, what are the complete list of responsibilities that he has, and the rights that she has, and it's a document that's signed, and there are witnesses to it. It's promulgated by the court, and the court will actually enforce it. It's a completely one-sided document in her favor. And part of the document also details the payment in the event that the marriage ends one way or another, either ends in divorce, there is a lump payment that he has to give, or it ends in death, God forbid, his death. Then out of his estate comes the ksuba payment given to his wife. So the book is primarily about that. And an interesting little nugget about this, the Talmud says that this is actually primarily rabbinic. This law, this ordinance, and the sages say that this is designed to disincentivize divorce. Today we have prenups that are almost designed to facilitate divorces, right? You don't want to let this woman take all your property, right? And all your assets and so on. So the prenup law is designed to actually make it easier to grease the wheels of divorce, to make the annulment of the marriage more seamless. The prenup, the ksuba law, it's the opposite. It's to make it more of a penalty, to make it confiscatory upon him, the payment that he'll have to place, that he'll have to provide, and that way, please God, even when the marriage hits a rocky point, as it invariably does, he will be disincentivized to divorce. Now, there's a very interesting nickname that this book has. Of course, that's the primary subject of the book, is these documents, the prenup document. But many other laws are interspersed and featured in the book, and it was given a nickname. It's known as Shas Katan. which translates as a miniature Talmud. All of Talmud like in miniature. It's a microcosm of all of Talmud is this book, because so many different laws and different core concepts that are featured throughout the whole Talmud are found in this book as well. So you want to get like a digest of all of Talmud, this is the book for you. Now the Rambam, in his introduction to Mishnah, he's spending a lot of time talking about the order of things. So the first two books, Yevamos and Subos. Yevamos deals with levirate marriages. It's very non-standard. Subos is the most standard thing. Every Jewish marriage has a tsuba. So which one of them should come first? The thing that's like standard, or the thing that's very, very rare and unusual? Why does it start with Yevamos and not with Subos? So he says a very interesting answer. He says that marriage is voluntary. If someone wants to get married, they get married, provided they have a willing accomplice, of course. This is something that is optional. You don't want to get married? Okay, that's your decision. And even though it's important for us to get married, we have to fulfill the mitzvah of procreation. So it's obligatory from that sense, but the court will never demand that a person gets married. They'll do nothing. It's not their responsibility. It's his responsibility. However, when it comes to levirate marriage, the brother died without children, there is this association between the surviving brother or brothers and the widow, and therefore it is not voluntary. It is obligatory for them to resolve this association one way or the other, and therefore the order of books, of tractates in this section of Mishnah, it starts off with the part that's obligatory, and then it proceeds to talk about the things that are optional. Okay, the next book does not really seem to be associated with women at all. It's the book of Nidarim. Nidarim means oaths and vows. Now, what does that mean? That means when a person says, I hereby accept the following vow: to do something, to not do something, to ban myself from something, to ban others from something that I own. I make an oath to do X or to not do X. The prohibitory oaths and vows are the subject of the book. What are the different ways that a person can initiate a vow? What are the ways that a person can initiate an oath? What are the things that are permitted initially, but can be made prohibited via an oath or a vow? All the different types, all the different ways that they can be initiated, and there's actually a way for them to be annulled and undone, and the different criteria for that. Very, very detailed. The Torah tells us in the book of Bamidbar, when a person makes a neder, a vow for God, or a shvuah, which is an oath, to prohibit something upon his soul, he cannot violate his words. Whatever comes out of his mouth, he shall do. The concept of the oath and the vow is that a person has the ability with their words to create new areas of prohibition that were not previously prohibited, new obligations that were not previously obligatory. And there's a lot of fascinating depth to understand the mechanics of how it works. So just as an example, this is something which appears really in the deep analysis of many different parts of the Talmud. There's the question of the gavra or the cheftza. Now, if that does not make sense to you, that's okay. I'll explain what it is in a second. But this is one of the basic parts of the Talmudic nomenclature. Gavra, cheftza. Now, these are words that are not even in Hebrew. Gavra means, it's Aramaic, it means the man, the person. Cheftza means the thing, the entity. So here's the question. Suppose a person makes a vow and says, I hereby commit to make a vow to not consume apples for 30 days. If the person were to violate that vow, they would be violating the Torah because they have created a new prohibition with their words. This is the law of a vow. Where exactly does this new prohibition reside? Is it on the person? Or is it on the apple? Is it on the gavra? Or is it on the cheftza, on the person or on the thing, on the entity? So the Talmud says that, well, it depends. A vow is different than an oath. A vow creates a certain halachic process or a certain effectuation of a halachic reality on a thing. Whereas an oath creates a certain effectuation of a halachic reality on the person. And this is actually the very beginning of the Talmud in the book of Nedarim. That's where it talks about this concept, which is applied to many different deeper analyses throughout the Talmud. Very interesting. I will tell you, we're a little more than a month away from Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the holiest day of them all. And Yom Kippur begins, of course, there's a lot of prayer that we do on Yom Kippur, but the very first thing that happens in the shul throughout the world on Yom Kippur is Kol Nidre. The word Nidre, that's the same word as Nedarim, the name of this book. Kol Nidre means all the vows. We begin Yom Kippur with a public annulment of all the vows. Because vows are maybe the thing that there's the greatest delta between how humans view their severity and how the Torah views their severity. Everyone knows that murder is just unconscionable. We know it, whether a person is religious or not, observant or not. Everyone knows it. And the Torah, of course, holds it as being of the most gravest severity. But when we think words are cheap, right? Talk is cheap. All talk, no action. In the Torah, the severity of words and of new halachic realities that are effectuated with words, it's very, very severe. But people, maybe they disregard it. They don't value it as much. And therefore, we begin Yom Kippur with this annulment of all the vows, because you can't really enter Yom Kippur when you have vows that were not fulfilled, vows that were violated. That's not a way to start Yom Kippur. And actually, there are other annulment of vows. Before Rosh Hashanah, there is a very interesting process known as the Hataras Nadarim, the annulment of vows that's done in front of a court. We don't want to be judged in any way, in any dimension. We don't want to be scrutinized on Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur, when we have the specter of vows hanging over our heads like the sword of Damocles. Now, the question is, of course, what does this have to do with the book of women? Why is it in any way involved with women? So the Rambam addresses that because there are areas of vows that women make that can be annulled by their husbands or fathers. Meaning, if a father is responsible for his young daughter, she makes a vow, the father could say, I hereby, with the power vested in me by God in the Torah, I am annulling your vow. Means there's different ways to annul the vows, either in front of the court or in front of the sage, where you say, well, I made the vow, but I didn't realize X, Y, or Z. Okay, that would be grounds for the annulment of the vow, but there's also the annulment of the vow without any cause that can be done by a husband or a father, and that's why it ends up in the book of women. Also, it is juxtaposed to the book of Tshubos because there is a section in Tshubos, like we said, it covers the whole Talmud. It's a miniature Talmud, but there's a section that deals with vows as well. Now, once we talk about vows and the book of Nedarim, we have the next book, which also has nothing to do with women, and really it should belong in the section of Mishnah that deals with purity, impurity, that deals with sacrifices. But because it is also initiated with a vow, it's juxtaposed to the book of Nedarim, and that is the book of Nazir. What's a Nazir? A Nazir is someone who accepts a vow to behave like a Nazir, meaning to refrain from cutting their hair, to refrain from impurity as if they are a high priest, and to withhold from wine, from grapes, and from any grape derivatives, typically for a 30-day period, but it could be a period of any length. The person says, I'm a Nazir for a year or so on, or 10 years, or 5 years, or whatever it is. That is the period that they must maintain their status as a Nazir. God forbid, if a person is a Nazir and for whatever reason their term is prematurely aborted, they encounter a dead person. They just have to be there, or they're on the bus and someone dies right in front of them. They become impure and they thus violated their Nazir status. They have to restart and the whole process of purifying and so on. Very detailed, very intricate process. What happens if it ends prematurely? You have to, and how you restart it, how you go back to the beginning, what happens when you actually finish it, and the very intricate process of finishing it and kind of restoring yourself to be an ordinary layperson. Today, a person, would they to accept a vow of a Nazir, they would become a Nazir. Today, you can become a Nazir, but until the temple is rebuilt, you cannot complete your term and cease being a Nazir, because part of the process of finishing up your term is to go to the temple, bring a sacrifice, and so on. We still have today, there are some very interesting stories of people who actually became a Nazir in modern times and must maintain all those laws, but you see them invariably, they have very long beards and very long hair, because you cannot cut it so long as you're a Nazir, and there's no way to end that until the temple is rebuilt. I want to read to you a few interesting Mishnahs in this book. In chapter 3, it talks about how the ideal place, really the only place, where a person can be a Nazir is inside the land of Israel. And the reason for that is because outside the land of Israel, there is some degree of impurity. The Nazir has to remain pure. Well, if he's outside the land, there is some degree of impurity that's present there, and therefore it's not really the fulfillment of the full laws of the Nazir. So suppose someone becomes a Nazir and they're outside the land of Israel and they finish their term, but then they come to the land. So they have to kind of reaccept the Nazir status again to do it properly, this time in the land of Israel. But how long do they have to do it? Suppose they were a Nazir for 5 years outside the land of Israel. And now they come into the land, so they have to do it again. But according to the Academy of Shammai, they just have to do it for 30 days. It's like a token fulfillment of being a Nazir. And the Academy of Hillel argues and said, no, they have to be for the same duration that they completed their term of a Nazir outside the land of Israel. They have to do it in the land. So if it's 5 years or a year, whatever it is, they have to do that again in the land. And then it brings a hysterical story. There was a queen. Hilni the queen. Her son went to war. And she made a conditional vow to become a Nazir. Women can become a Nazir, yes. In the event my son returns home safely from this war, I accept a vow to be a Nazir for 7 years. Now, if her son were to die in the war, she wouldn't be absolved because the condition was not met. But indeed, her son came back from war. So she was a Nazir for 7 years. And then at the end of 7 years, she went to the land of Israel. Wonderful. Ma'am, I got some bad news. 7 more years for you. As per the ruling of the Academy of Hillel. And then, at the end of 7 years, she's almost finished. It's been 14 years, right? She became impure. She somehow encountered the dead, and now she had to start all over. So she ended up being a Nazir for 21 years. At least that's the main opinion of the Mishnah, which is very interesting. Of course, the Talmud elaborates upon it, as it does in every law of the Mishnah. We have the Talmudic elaboration of the details of the Mishnah. One more interesting Mishnah from chapter 7. There are 2 people who may never, under almost any circumstances, come into contact with the dead. Of course, there's the Nazir, and then there's the high priest. So if you have a priest, any priest cannot come into contact with the dead. But if someone is not the high priest, they're an ordinary priest, then there are 7 relatives to whom they are permitted to become impure. Father, mother, sister, brother, son, daughter, wife. In any of those relationships, God forbid if one of them dies, they can participate in the funeral. But that's only an ordinary Kohen. The Kohen Gadol, the high priest, not even any relatives. Similarly, the Nazir, so long you're a Nazir for 30 days or a year, whatever it is, you cannot participate in the funeral of any relatives. There's only one possible circumstance when a high priest and a Nazir must become impure and tend to the burial of someone. And that's when they find a mace mitzvah, which means a dead body that has no one to bury them. They find a body, and it's just strewn about. And there's just no one to tend to it. It's a terrible disgrace. In that case, the high priest and the Nazir must become impure. So the Mishnah talks about a case where there's a stroll. The high priest and a Nazir, they're strolling, just them two. And they encounter a mace mitzvah, a dead body that has no one to bury it. Which of these two should tend to it? People ask the question. Laws of the Mishnah, like how could there be debate? The sages always found the most remote cases and cases that were not previously adjudicated. If you had to ask the question, like, how often did this ever happen? I would bet it never happened even once before. How could it be that the high priest would travel by himself without a retinue? It's hard to imagine this ever happened in history. Of course, the Mishnah is trying to give us the law, so it will find the most remote cases and will leave no stone unturned. So which one, if one of them are by themselves, then they have to tend to the dead body. But now there's 2 of them. Which one of them should do it? So there's a machlokes, there's a dispute. According to Rabbi Eliezer, the high priest should bury the body. According to the sages, which means the plurality, no, it should be the Nazir. Now, what's the rationale? So Rabbi Eliezer says, suppose a high priest becomes impure. Well, okay, you became impure, purify yourself, and that's it. The Nazir who becomes impure must also bring a sacrifice, an atonement sacrifice for becoming impure. So the fact that the Torah obligated the Nazir who becomes impure to bring an atonement sacrifice, it must be that it's worse for him to become impure than for the high priest to become impure. And therefore, if one of them has to become impure, it should be the high priest. That's the logic of Rabbi Eliezer. It sounds like a good argument. And the sages responded, no, we have a different argument. Let the Nazir become impure, because the Nazir's purity and holiness is only temporary. However long a person is a Nazir, it's 30 days, it's a year, it's 5 years, it's 21 years, whatever it is, it's still limited. Whereas a Kohen, for the rest of his life, every single moment of his life, he is a Kohen. And he is barred from impurity. And thus, it's a worse violation when the high priest becomes impure than when the Nazir becomes impure. But this is a classic example of a dispute. Which is worse? And there's an argument to either side. Rabbi says, well, it's worse for the Nazir who has to make a sacrifice. It's worse for him to become impure, therefore the high priest to become impure. Come along, the sages say, no, it's worse for the high priest to become impure because his purity is eternal versus the purity, the holiness of the Nazir, which is temporary, and therefore it's better that the Nazir becomes impure. And the last 3 books are Sota, Gittin, and Kiddushin. Sota is the laws of the suspected adulteress. Gittin is divorces and divorce documents. Kiddushin is marriage and the initiation of marriage and betrothal. There's a little bit of a dispute what the order is. According to the Rambam, he has Gittin, Sota, Kiddushin, just the order of the books. The order that we have is different. We have Sota, and then Gittin, and then Kiddushin. Now, just to go, we'll follow our order just for the sake of simplicity here. The Sota is a woman whose husband is jealous and is wary of her. And he warns her, don't seclude with this and this person. And she, after being warned to not seclude with this person, she secludes with him for a sufficient amount of time for something untoward to have happened. So we have a marriage that's in distress. What's going to be with this marriage? We don't know what happened behind closed doors. God forbid, was there adultery behind closed doors? We don't know. And the husband, of course, he's suspicious of his wife. And we don't know how to resolve this. The law of Sota is there to resolve this and to restore marital harmony. So if the woman actually admits, yeah, I had an affair, God forbid, and I was unfaithful, well, in that case, the marriage is over and he could divorce her. He's actually not obligated to pay her severance package of the ksuba that we talked about some moments ago. And they're done. Their relationship is over. And by the way, she's also prohibited to marry the perpetrator. The man, the adulterer, who also committed this horrific offense, he's not allowed to marry the woman that he committed adultery with. Now, of course, if we have witnesses and testimony to this event, we don't know what happens behind closed doors, but suppose we do have witnesses, adultery in the Torah is a capital offense, both for the man and for the woman. But suppose she admits, then there's this resolution. She gets divorced. She cannot marry not the original husband, not the perpetrator, and that's the end of the story. But suppose the woman maintains her innocence. No, I went behind closed door. That's bad, but nothing happened. In that case, she's brought to the temple, and she brings a certain sacrifice, and the sages and the judges try to resolve what happened, but if she maintains her innocence steadfastly, she is tested with the bitter waters. A portion of the Torah is written on a parchment. It's dissolved in water, so you have water with a little bit of ink from the Torah. She drinks it, and that would test her. If she was innocent, she would actually be blessed. If she was guilty, then the waters would try her and would actually be a form of capital punishment, both for her, by the way, and for the perpetrator and for the adulterer. It's basically the only law of the Torah, our sages tell us, that is a miracle. That this process, that the court would take the parchment upon which the entire section of the law of the adulteress, of suspected adulteress, is written, dissolve it in water, she drinks it, and that actually tests her. And she would die, really, on the spot, as would the perpetrator, if they were, in fact, guilty. Now, of course, a wonderful Mishnah, wonderful book, wonderful Talmud. We can spend a lot of time talking about it. But I want to maybe read to you just a few interesting citations. In chapter 1 of this book, it tells us a divine policy. There's a divine policy that is present here with the Sota. What she did and the behavior that she undertook, that measure for measure is what she receives. So she adorned herself to do a sin. Well, in the event that she was guilty, she becomes the opposite of beautiful. She would really explode, it would say, miraculously. And she did a sin in a certain fashion. And it's the Mishnah tells us that the way that this almost poison, this bitter waters, the way it would try her would mimic the way that she did the sin. And then the Mishnah broadens the idea and says, We have many other examples of this. So Shimshon, Samson, of course, Samson was one of the judges, but he followed his eyes, and that's why his eyes were gouged out. And Avshalom, he was proud of his hair, and his hair was his undoing. And because he consorted with 10 of his father's wives, therefore he was peppered with 10 spares. And similarly, the opposite is also true. Miriam, she waited for Moshe when he was in the box. And therefore when she had Saras, the nation waited for her. And Joseph tended to the burial of his father. And that's when Moshe tended to Joseph's burial. He extracted Joseph's bones from Egypt. Oh, and Moshe tended to the burial of Joseph. God himself tended to the burial of Moshe. Two more interesting things about this book. In chapter 5, there's a long string of Mishnahs that talk about teachings that were done bo bayom, on that day. It gives a whole list of seemingly unrelated teachings that were all taught on that day. And this is referring to one of the most significant events of the post-destruction of the temple era. There was the leader of the academy who was deposed. His name was Rabban Gamliel. He was fired from his job. That's a very dramatic story we talked about in the past. But he was fired. And they replaced him with a young sage named Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. And he changed the policy of who is admitted to the academy. Because Rabbi Gamliel had a much stricter criteria for who was allowed to join the discussions, the debates. Any sage who had even the smallest flaw or shortcoming was barred, was disallowed from entering. And when he was fired and the new regime took over control, the new administration took over, they were much more loose about who they allowed in. And they added hundreds or thousands of benches to accommodate all the new scholars and sages that joined the ranks of the academy. And on that day, there was an explosion of Torah. And all the teachings throughout the Mishnah and the Talmud that start off by saying Bo Bayam on that day, it's a reference to that very day where the policies of who was admitted to the academy were changed, were liberalized, and thus there were so many wonderful new teachings and development and proliferation of Torah. And the final 3 chapters of this book talk about many different areas of law that have declarations. And the question is, must they be said in the original Hebrew, or can they be said in any language? So it starts off by saying, these are the things that can be said in any language. Declaration of the tithes, the reading of the Shema, prayer, grace after the meal, and so on. Different oaths that the court would obligate certain witnesses, and other oaths, and also the section of the Sota. That can be done in any language, and these are the ones that must be said in Hebrew. There's a long list of things that must be said in Hebrew, and then goes through one at a time to explain and elaborate each one of these different procedures and their laws. Now, the final 2 books of the order of Nashim, of women, are Gittin and Kiddushin. And like Yevamos starts off as 6 verses, and you spend a whole year or a decade to study it all. Both Gittin and Kiddushin, which is the initiation, the inception of marriage, and the halachic details of that, and the annulment of marriage via divorce, they are basically 4 verses. Also in this week's parsha, chapter 24 of the book of Devarim, it talks about when there's a marriage, and the marriage is not working out so well, and they don't like each other, and then there's a divorce, and there's the process of writing the divorce, and the Torah describes where the husband takes the document of divorce and places it in her hand and sends her away, and she can go marry someone else. We have 4 verses in the Torah You get to the Mishnah, you see chapter upon chapter, and then you get to the Talmud, and it'll take you multiple years to finish the Talmuds of these two books, Gittin and Kiddushin. I will say that my two oldest boys are in Yeshiva High School here in Houston, and this year they just started the school year, and they're studying the book of Kiddushin, which is the laws of marriage initiation, how to effectuate the transaction of marriage. I want to read to you, just to wrap this up, a very interesting set of Mishnahs at the end of chapter 1 of Kiddushin. So the first one, very interesting, it says that any mitzvah that is agricultural, means it's dependent upon the land. All the agricultural laws apply only in the land of Israel. And laws that are not agricultural, well, then they apply equally in the land of Israel and outside of it. And there are only two exceptions. There are two agricultural laws that apply outside the land. Number one, Orla. 3 years of a fruit tree, the first 3 years are prohibited. And number two, Kilayim, which is the admixture of different seeds, prohibited to mix different seeds together. We have to have separation between the different species. But the final Mishnah of chapter 1 of Kiddushin talks about the reward. The reward for mitzvos. Kala osa mitzvah achas, whoever does one mitzvah. Then, from heaven, they will do good to him and make his days long, and he will inherit the land. Which, by the way, the sages referred to them. That means the world to come. And God forbid, if someone does not do a mitzvah, ein meitivim lo, they will not do good to him, and they will not lengthen his days, and he will not inherit the land. And if someone is proficient in scripture and in Mishnah, so it's the written Torah and oral Torah, U'b'derech does have character, refined and elevated character. Lo b'mehera hu chota. This person, it's very likely that they'll sin. They have the prophylaxis against sin. But God forbid, if someone does not have proficiency in scripture or in Mishnah, and does not have refined and elevated character, eino min hayishuv, he is not from civilization, meaning he's just a pariah to society. And the Rambam, as he does, he's trying to talk about the order of, or the sequencing of the Mishnah. Gittin is divorce. That comes before Kiddushin, which is marriage. Why is that so? It should be the opposite. Of course, marriage is preferable than divorce. Divorce is a sad and tragic thing. At the end of the book of Gittin, it says that if someone gets divorced, even the altar in the temple cries. It's so sad. So divorce is like a last resort, right? First, it should be Kiddushin, marriage, the initiation, the inception of the relationship. And then should be Gittin. So why? The Rambam says, because if you look at the aforementioned set of verses, chapter 24 of Devarim, it starts first with divorce, and then after divorce it says that she shall go and marry another man, and therefore, just based upon the order of the verses, that's why the order of the Mishnah was done thusly. Thus concludes our very, very brief, very cursory exploration of the third order of Mishnah. I recommend all of y'all to read it, to study it. We're trying to get more literacy, more of an understanding of the vast depths and breadth of the Torah. We're studying Rambam's introduction to Mishnah, and we're going through the orders of the Mishnah. We have 3 up and 3 down. We finished 3 of them, and please God, we'll continue to explore the final 3 orders of the Mishnah, just very briefly. A snapshot, a brief overview of those orders and the books inside of them. And they are Nezikin, of course, interpersonal laws and damages, and the final 2, Kachim and Taros, the laws of sacrifices, purities, and impurities. We have a lot yet to explore. My email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com.